Thank you so much for coming to our PLC webinar series. The last particular webinar in this PLC series, Determining Needs and Implementing Interventions. First and foremost, as usual, we want to thank the Department of Education. They are the reason that we're able to bring you these particular webinars at no cost. Everyone is muted. Make sure you ask questions in the Q&A. I have myself and my colleague Marissa here that will be sort of trading on and off today, so we'll be manning that Q&A. We will also be sending an email tomorrow. It will be a full 24 hours plus after this webinar ends. It will have the PD certificate. It will have the information about the video, the slides, and any other documents like the PLC binder and all that in there. At the end, there's a brief survey. We've been checking the results as we go along and making some changes here and there, so your feedback is much appreciated. I am Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the folks that is going to be presenting this afternoon. I also have my colleague here, Marissa Hooper.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you today.
And we have Kristen Crawford, who is your main contact for the Department of Ed for this data coaching contract. And her information is also at the end of this webinar. Just a reminder, last time of the key understandings for this particular PLC series. Again, this is for the whole series of webinars. So if you haven't, been part of the first couple of webinars, or if you've missed any of them, this is the whole thing. So we want to make sure that y'all are understanding what high functioning professional learning communities are, and that they are about not only student learning, but also adult learning. We also want to make sure you understand the responsibilities and what you have as educators and what you are doing during any sort of professional learning community cycle. We're going to talk a little bit about the last parts of that today. And we want to make sure that we're having you understand how to implement some of these systems so that you can have high functioning PLCs in your school. Just a note, I've said it before and I want to say it again. PLCs are not just a meeting. They are a way of being and a way of doing things in schools that is data related and a fully collaborative way of going through our instruction and looking at data. So it doesn't just happen during our meetings. It happens throughout the building in multiple capacities. Today, in this last webinar, we're going to look specifically at determining appropriate supports based on the data outcomes. So we're going to take a peek at a couple of a math and an ELA scenario and what we would be able to do and how we would go about implementing any sort of intervention or additional help. We're going to give you some general rules of thumb about interventions for math and ELA and some non-invasive, not super time-consuming methods for progress monitoring. The first thing I want to do is just do a quick overview of PLC. So we'll get started here. The review of what we've sort of talked about in the last 3 webinars is, for some reason it's not coming. There we go. We talked about highly functional teams. We talked about what a common definition of PLC is. We talked about the different practices to get started and making sure that we have those protocols and effective communication. We looked at some data and established year-long SMART goals. We looked at cycle goals. We looked at how we could articulate those particular goals to make them measurable. And we talked about those initial assessment and just general assessment options, along with formatting data and going through that data dive process. So in just a few snippets here, again, this is an ongoing process. The big words here, collaboratively and reoccurring. We want to make sure that we're all working together and that we are doing everything we can to serve our students in the best ways possible. A lot of PLC has to do with us as educators learning from one another and continuing to hone in on those best practices for instruction. We have the three big ideas of PLC. We want to ensure that all students learn. We're creating that culture of collaboration, and we're focusing on those results. As we're going through and thinking about those results, we want to think about what exactly we want students to be learning. So we want those learning outcomes to be really defined and clear for us and for our students. We want to think about how we're going to know if they've learned those particular skills and if they're able to apply those skills. We want to figure out what we're going to do if they haven't learned all of that and what we're going to do if they have. Again, PLC is a whole school community. It is everybody working together towards a common goal. It is not us closing our doors and saying, I've got this, I've already figured this out, I'm good. It is opening up our doors and inviting folks in so that we can be better prepared ourselves and we can help others within our building. All of this has the main goal of making sure that we are getting the highest level of student performance as we can. So that's the big reason for all of this. In that, we also have shared vision and collective commitments and those shared goals. And we're all working together to either be that piece of the full puzzle or that gear to keep things going. We know what happens when we're missing one of the gears or one of the puzzle pieces is missing. It becomes really challenging. So we've given you some information here to try to make it a safe and as easy a process as possible to implement. We looked here at the year-long roadmap. So we looked at establishing teams. We looked at creating a year-long goal, creating those SMART goals. And we also talked about in that we were looking at the 5 components of successful teams, having those agreements or those norms, roles for people, and creating that climate that is a really safe and inviting place for staff members to be. We want those consistent protocols so that it's predictable and that there's no sort of question of what we're doing when. Those shared measurable goals that we reflect on not just 3 times a year, but as much as possible to make sure that we are continuing to do everything we can to meet those goals. And then we want to help everybody be accountable and to know what their sort of role in all of this is and what they need to be doing to ensure that the students that they are working with are meeting those high standards as well. And those defined timelines to make it really visible for when we're meeting, what we're meeting about, and who needs to be there. The shared and articulated measurable goals, these are just some things that we talked about. Obviously, it's going to help us be accountable. Again, we're not just looking at this 3 times a year. We're looking at this in a very systematic way to continue to do everything we can. We can revise the goal if students are meeting that goal or if we need to make any adjustments. We have action items associated with that goal that are not just crossing our fingers and hoping that the kids are going to make some progress. We want to make sure that those goals are meaningful, that they're challenging, keeping those standards high and not just lowering our standards thinking that students are not going to be able to meet those standards, but they also need to be achievable in some way. And we want to make sure we review those goals frequently. When it comes to data, we talked about different types of data. Longitudinal data helps us guide instruction over extended periods of time. We can use longitudinal data a lot of times to create those SMART goals. And there's just different ways to be able to look at it. You could look at a single grade level over multiple years. So if I taught 7th grade, I could look at 7th grade over the last 4 years that I've been teaching and see what the results are. You can look at a cohort. Are you still looking at that? How are these particular group of kids that I have right now, how have they done historically in different grade levels? And then you can look at your current year students. Other types of data that we look at, and this is what we've been talking about a lot, is this formative data that is helping us guide our real-time instructional decisions. We're going to be talking about formative data today as well. It can help us differentiate. There's all different ways. Again, you can look at it as a whole grade level. That's the way that we would recommend you looking at it as a whole grade level, so that everybody can talk about what they're doing in their classrooms, what's working, what's not working. But you can also look at your own classroom level or your intervention or group level, which is what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. Here's our data-driven dialogue. These are the phases that we go through whenever we are looking at a specific piece of data. I just want to make it clear, though, the data-driven dialogue is for those big data dives where we're really trying to dive into the information and make a lot of decisions based off of a formal data dive. This particular data-driven dialogue, if you're looking at formative data, you can still use this particular protocol, but sometimes when the pieces of data are a little bit smaller, or you're trying to look at it with a group, you wouldn't necessarily follow every single one of these steps. But this is for those big data dives when we're taking a look and creating SMART goals and moving on with them. This is the format that we follow. There's a protocol here for folks that are not used to this particular data-driven dialogue, and it walks you through the steps. And then there's a short form here that's linked as well, where people can put their general information about each part of this process. This is part of the long form. It gives you information about each one of the phases. One of the things we like to point out about the phases is there's a lot of questions that you can answer. There's some guidelines for timeframes on each one of them as well. You'll see on many of them that there is some silent time. That's to allow people to have some think time before they start diving into the data. Quite frankly, it's for people maybe like Marissa and I that are very good at looking at data, and we can just start talking about it and end up maybe sort of driving conversation where other folks might have some other insight that would be really valuable as well. We want to give them that time to be able to gather their thoughts. Here's that data dive short form. So this allows you to capture all the information for each phase of the data-driven dialogue. And then here's the creating SMART goals. This is the graphic that we have where it's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And here are all of those protocols and those worksheets that can help us create those SMART goals. In our sessions, we created a year-long goal for reading, and we then created a cycle goal. So we talked about how the year-long goal is something that we're looking at for the full year. And then we create cycle goals depending on how students are doing within a 6 or 8 week period of time. And those will change depending on how students are doing with their assessments and how they're able to show their understandings. We talked about specific initial assessments. These were just some examples of things that you could use as an initial assessment. Big note is that the initial assessment or pre-assessment should match the post-assessment so that you're looking apples to apples. This is how they looked in the beginning, and this is how they have changed and improved over time. So for that year-long roadmap, we're talking again today a little bit more about this instructional cycle and what we're doing within the instructional cycle. And so we'll get into that now.
Okay, so we're going to get into that now. We're going to start talking about how we can use data to really dig into this, this learning cycle, this instructional cycle for students. So the PLC model, and I know we touched upon this last time, is that we're really focusing on one year-long goal. We're not trying to, do a little bit of everything. We have this 1 year long goal. We'll put, everything that we've done throughout the year in our pockets for the following years. So our tier 1 instruction is really going to support the year-long goal. We're not going to focus the whole year on just this goal. We have lots of things to teach, but we do want to make sure that we're supporting this goal throughout the year in some way, shape, or form. However, all of our interventions that we can give to students are going to feed into this year-long goal. So we know that students are going to need help and that they're at different levels in their thinking. So we need to make sure that we are helping them at whichever, point in their thinking that they may be at. And we're going to intervene at their level of thinking. So we have this year-long goal, and then we have our cycle goals that are going to feed in or support that year-long goal. So we're going to walk you through this again quickly, but just to show you how then it supports the instructional cycle. So we want to make sure that, when we're doing this, we're looking at our data. We have the standards that we have as a reference, so we know what we're looking at. We also have the priorities of the standards. So if that's in math, we know what our priority, additional, and supporting standards are. And reading and writing are a little different, but making sure that we do have those power standards as well. And that also that there's, teacher input there, what you see in your classroom with your students. So this is an example of the 3 years of New Hampshire SAS data. So this is just here to show you that, we have this historical data, that longitudinal data that Heather was referring to create this year-long goal. So we've created our year-long goal. We've decided that we need our 5th grade students to work on performing operations with multi-digit whole numbers with decimals. They were below proficient, and we want them to be at or above proficient, or an area of strength on the next year's New Hampshire SAS summative assessment. So that's our year-long goal. We then had to determine our cycle goals. So for cycle 1, we have to give an initial assessment to determine where they're at with this. So this is an example of some modular data from the New Hampshire SAS. We have, no student names now, but you can have student names. We have the correct answer frequency for both the students and the class as a whole. So right now we want to look at the class as a whole and see how they're doing with these specific standards. So again, in that formatting data, we have making sure we have, the maximum amount of points, the standards, things like that. So we have all our standards listed here, and we can see, how the class is doing with those specific standards. We can see that on these 2 standards listed here is where students in our tier 1 instruction are struggling the most. So we see 21% of the students got it correct for 5.nbt.2 and 26 got it correct for 5.nbt.6. So we want to take a look at, what kinds of questions, what standards those are. So if we take a look, we can see exactly what comes up. One is about explaining patterns in the number of zeros in a product, powers of 10. And then one is about finding whole number quotients. So though we know that these are 2 areas that the entire class really needs some work on. So we decided in our PLC, we want to focus on 5.nbt.6. We want to find whole number quotients, with dividends, 4-digit dividends and 2-digit divisors. This is what we decided we're going to focus on for our cycle 1 goal. So we've written that goal for cycle 1 that we're currently at 26%. We want to improve to at least 90% correct answer frequency. So, we walked through this in the last few webinars. We just wanted to put it in there so that we can see, we've done all this work. Now, what do we do? What do we do in this instructional cycle time with this information? So just a reminder, we talked about this in our first webinar. This is really the instructional cycle and how those 4 driving questions for PLC, where they really come into play. So really what we want our students to learn, how will we know when they have learned it? We've done that. Now we want to focus on what are we going to do if they have learned it, and what are we going to do if they haven't. So we're going to interpret and plan intervention. We want to make sure we're instructing and assessing our students. We're evaluating, we're planning. This is what we're going to focus on. So we want to make sure that we are starting with our highly effective research-based core instruction. It all starts in tier 1. We want to make sure we are continuing that. We need to make sure that we are systematically identifying students who are succeeding, who are understanding this, as well as students who are not succeeding or who are at an earlier point in their thinking. We want to make sure that those students who are not necessarily getting it at first, that we're providing them with additional both time and support so that they can master these targets and these goals that we've set for them. And we want to make sure that we're extending for those students who are meeting those targets. So, not just giving them more, but going deeper, switching it up, things like that. We also want to make sure that this is all peer collaboration. So when we're in our PLC meetings or we're visiting classrooms, seeing what's working, that we are doing this together. We're learning from each other. We are planning together. So we want to make sure that this is still happening. We're doing this as a PLC team, not as an individual teacher. So this is our PLC cycle planning sheet here that we're going to use now to help us, talk about what are we going to do in tier 1 instruction and what can we do in tier 2 and tier 3. So we want to make sure that we're breaking apart the standard. This is what we're focusing on. 5.npt.6. We are finding whole number quotients. It's a very long standard. We want to make sure we're breaking that down a little bit. So we need to make sure that in this, that we're really making sure that we're using strategies based specifically on place value, properties of operations, and relationships between multiplication and division. If you're a math teacher, you know that the standard algorithm should not be introduced yet. It's not in this standard. We need to make it more conceptual for our students. So we decide that we're going to really focus on place value strategies. So this is our cycle planning sheet that we can do as a PLC. I just want to explain it just a little bit. We have our cycle goal. We know that we want to use the traditional, we don't want to use the traditional algorithm. We want to use place value. We don't want them to memorize steps. Clearly it's not working. So we need to make some changes. So this first part, this whole class differentiated instruction, this is our tier 1 instruction. So if you teach math, you know that you're not going to teach whole number division for the entire year. So how can you, really focus on this goal if you're not teaching division every single day? So in their whole class instruction, we just want to make sure that we're dedicating an extra 10 minutes a day on this specific goal that we have. So it could be our warm up, it could be a closing, a number talk, whatever we're doing, we want to make sure. And we're going to progress monitor by doing some weekly exit tickets for our students, seeing what they're getting. Are they, taking our strategies and applying them? Are we moving forward? Are we not? So this is where we can plan that. The teacher responsible and location. Sometimes if you're lucky to be in a co-teaching classroom or you have some paraeducators in there, you can put, more than one person responsible, or if you have the ability to have other locations, sometimes we don't. So for this specific example, we have these small groups that we're going to, really put our kids' practice into. We'll focus on some different strategies and activities. We can rotate some of them. and we're going to progress monitor those specific groups. We then have our intervention and extension. However, here we have listed our tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. So remember that Heather is going to go into this in a little bit, but that tier 2 intervention can still happen in the classroom. So if you have a case manager, paraeducator, any sort of co-teacher with you, or maybe you have some time with them, or if you do have an RTI MTSS model win time, then you can, focus on these specific strategies and activities for students in that tier 2 classroom. And then we have our tier 3 as well, which is a more direct instruction, those students who really need that extra time in order to grasp these concepts. So we have those progress monitoring strategies. And this, again, this cycle planning we're doing with our peer collaboration. We can talk about it, what's working. Maybe if small group A is doing number talks and your data collection, you're showing that, wow, these students are really getting this based on these number talks. Share that, share your activities and what's working. That was a math example. We also just wanted to show an ELA example. So showing that, evidence and elaboration is a specific weakness, and writing for students based on some data that we've looked at. We have our year-long goal, again, and our cycle goals that are going to feed into that year-long goal. So if this is our year-long goal, we just want to make sure students can provide evidence and elaboration. We take a look at our standards, of course. We give that initial assessment. And for cycle 1, we are going to focus on informational writing. So they're going to work on evidence and elaboration for informational writing. Again, we have this cycle planning that we're going to do with our colleagues. And we just have, again, for tier 1, what are we going to do in our whole class instruction? Maybe one group's finding evidence, another's determining what evidence is appropriate, and maybe some evidence-based writing responses. How are we going to progress monitor that students are either making growth or they're not? And then we have our tier 2 and tier 3 that we are going to, find the most convincing evidence for that tier 2, make sure we're really working on that. And maybe tier 3 is determining, fact from fiction. And again, our progress monitoring strategies. We wanted to add these in here. I'm going to start actually at the bottom at the Lexile Quantile Hub. This is something that is super helpful, especially for you for finding, activities or videos, to help where students are at. If you put in their quantile score for math, it will let you know any prerequisite skills that they need and what they're ready for at the same time. So, and then along with that, it will give all these resources that can use. So it can really help in that intervention planning, in that tier 1 planning for activities that you can do with your students based on what they're ready for math. And then we also have yes, Heather's going to click on it for us. Sorry about that. So it's actually free for all New Hampshire educators. If you don't have a login, you just register with your school login. And you have a free account. So you can put in, we use the Common Core, you can put in New Hampshire, whatever grade level you teach, the standard in which you teach, or the standard that you're looking for some information of. So basically you put in the quantile range of your class, you can put in the quantile range of your small groups, and that can give you some more information. If you don't know the quantile range, the New Hampshire SAS actually gives you a quantile score, or quantile measure, shall I say. And basically it lets you know, if it's yellow, it's below their quantile range, right? They're ready for more. If it's green, it's perfect. This is what they're ready to learn. If it's blue, that might be above their quantile range. They're not ready for that just yet. But if you're focusing on a specific skill, again, it has the prerequisite skills that they need, as well as impending skills showing where this standard is going. Where Heather clicked, we have resources for students. Some have like 20 resources, some may only have 5, depending on what it is. So we have these resources here that, you know, just can help you differentiate for students. It's also great for if you have a Lexile measure for students. You know, you can find appropriate books if they're struggling and you're just trying to find, you know, a text that they can access. You can find those books here. It's a very awesome website. So take a look. If you ever have more questions about, you know, what you can do with this, reach out to us. We can always, you know, give you some more information. We also have the standards here, just always good to have in your back pocket. So these are here for you. You can read them. ELA, math, you know, don't forget about those mathematical practices. We also have the anchor standards for ELA. So those are all here for you. And lastly, we have the Achieve the Core Coherence Map. So for math, if your students are struggling and you are trying to figure out, you know, where do I start? If they're struggling with this standard, you know, what are all the prerequisite skills that they needed for this standard? Where do I kind of meet them where they're at or figure out what they're at? So this coherence map is very helpful. Heather's going to click into 5th grade. We are in number and operations in base 10. We are in point 6 was the standard that we were focusing on for our goal. We can map it. The first time you do it, these will come up. Hopefully the next time it won't. But so this is our standard. It also gives you an example of tasks. So you can use some tasks or download some tasks that you want to use with students. It gives you examples, things like that. And then if you look to the left, we can see all the standards that feed into this standard. So if you click on these, they'll come up and they'll be a little bigger. And you can read that this is students need to have mastered this standard before they can, you know, really fully grasp the standard that you're working on. So if you're ever wondering, you know, what did they need to know beforehand? And it keeps going. Also, it'll show you where this standard is going next, you know, what it's feeding into and where this leads to 6th grade and so forth. So these are just some links that we wanted to share with you that we think are super helpful. We're going to go into some ELA and math interventions and supports for students, but these are here for you for your use. I don't see any questions, but feel free if they come up to continue asking.
Okay, so next we're going to go on to Tier 1 supports and tiered interventions. So just a little bit of information about this to begin with. When we talk about tiered supports, we talk a lot about the MTSS framework and how a lot of these supports fall into that. Regardless of what you're calling it, RTI, response to intervention, win time, or what I need now, intervention blocks, intervention time, that's what we're talking about here. Any type of intervention that you might be doing in your building. We know this looks different depending on where you are. There are definitely some folks that are able to have specific intervention time each day. There are other folks that do not have specific intervention time, and you need to use time within your classroom to do that. So any of the things that we're going to be talking about during this particular section can be either done in your classroom or outside of your classroom, and it is not necessarily dependent on what your schedule is. So first things first, this is not really news to anybody, but we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. When we're talking about tiers of intervention, we're talking about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So that Tier 1 is that core classroom instruction. The tier 2 is that slightly targeted small group instruction, and then tier 3 is that intensive or individual instruction. As Marissa was talking about earlier, both of the tier 1 and tier 2 can be done within the classroom. Tier 3 is a little bit harder in that if you have specific students who need really intensive instruction, tier 3 should be done with a little bit more intensive and individual instruction than you can do within your classroom. Obviously, as the tiers increase, the level of support also increases. And just a reminder of who should be in what tiers. This has been sort of a hot debate recently. I wouldn't even say it's a debate. I would say that tier 3 in tier 2 is getting to be far more than the 5% we have listed here for tier 3 and the 15% of students for tier 2. This is, I also want to say that 80% for tier 1, this is not only 80% of your students are in your classroom for tier 1. It means that in tier 1 instruction, 80% of your students are understanding the information that you are giving to them. In tier 2, those 15% of those students maybe that need a little bit targeted small group instruction to be able to get that core understanding, and 5% of your students should need intense or individualized instruction. The reality is the tier 2 and tier 3 percentages are growing and growing and growing, and they're busting at the seams. So some of the information that we're talking about for interventions today, we want to make sure that you're dialed in for interventions, but we would be remiss if we did not say that the biggest focus you should have right now is tier 1. That's why we keep talking about the fact that you need to collaborate with your peers. You want to make sure that you're sharing your strategies. You want to make sure that you're all hands on deck as much as possible to ensure that all your students are learning. Because we can't have that tier 2 and tier 3 end up being flipped and have only 20% of your students really getting it and the rest of them going into tier 2 and tier 3, which is a little bit dramatic. It's not quite that at this point, but it's getting really, really high for that tier 2 and tier 3 instruction. Types of interventions, we have collaborative interventions, students working together. This doesn't even just need to be an intervention. This could be in the classroom. We are talking a lot about having students be able to collaborate and talk more frequently in the classrooms, and having them learn from each other. It's a great way to do intervention as well. We have one-to-one, obviously students working intensively with one educator. That seems to be a little bit more rare now. We're having more like 2 students with 1 teacher, but obviously we can do one-to-one. That classroom-based is a really great way of doing interventions. And as you start to, think about students collaborating in your classroom, when you have a truly collaborative environment with your whole group instruction, it allows you to do that classroom-based learning and support with those students who may end up needing it as well. We have some behavioral interventions. Marissa and I talk about this a lot whenever we're talking about students with behavioral needs. It's typically not just a behavior. It is due to the fact that they may not understand what is going on in the classroom, that they're frustrated. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world today with students, but behavior and academics is really hard to separate. We've been talking a lot about academics here. We're going to talk a little bit about behavioral and SEL, and just talk about the fact that they really can't be separated, even though we've been really focusing on that academic piece. I feel like if you're looking at the data and you're seeing students are not getting the information, and those students are having behavioral problems in the classroom, or they're shutting down, that those pieces of information work hand in hand. So we want to make sure we don't forget about that. And we don't forget about that social emotional learning that students have, and that awareness and self-management that's been really challenging for a lot of students. Again, can't really separate it out, I feel like, from academics. Academics and that social emotional piece are rarely completely separate. And peer tutoring is another way, having students pair with different levels of students together. We used to do this years ago with reading, and it's definitely something that can be helpful, but don't just rely on the peer tutoring all the time. Obviously, we want to make sure that those students who already have it, that they're not always having to be a teacher for somebody else, that we're also giving them what they need to be able to deepen their understanding, that isn't just helping somebody who might not understand. Some rules of thumb. Intervention needs to be research-based and supported. You do not need to buy a program. I know for RTI, a lot of people go through a systematic program for maybe reading or for math. It can be helpful to have that, but it's not necessary. Really good instruction and small group instruction that is just supported in some of the methods that we use and that are research supported is just as good as buying a program. So when we're talking about math, we're talking about using manipulatives, not just up to third grade. Manipulatives should be used all the way up through high school. It is something that I'm not sure why it's gone by the wayside, but manipulatives are one of the best ways to help intervene and to help students understand specific concepts. Chunking out the learning, making it, a little bit more understandable into smaller pieces. Again, delivering in a small group for those students who have a hard time focusing in the larger group setting. Having student goal setting or monitoring their own learning is highly advisable in the grade levels that can do that, which is almost every grade level. The research is showing that when students know what they need to be able to accomplish, they are far more it's far more common for them to accomplish those goals when they know what they're learning and what those goals are. And then those rereading for fluency. Some helpful resources. We're not going to go too much into these. The Florida Center for Reading Research has quite a bit of information about interventions. Same thing with the What Works Clearinghouse. We always like to give you some links here to be able to go and kind of check out on your own. So those will be available on the slide deck here. Again, just kind of going back to what I was just saying about having students do their goal setting or understand what they're learning. We talk about John Hattie a lot whenever we talk about data or whenever we talk about instruction. Visible learning, or having students monitor their own learning and truly understand what they are required to do and what their success criteria is the second leading indicator of student success of anything we can do as teachers. Number one, PLC, and that is having all teachers working together collaboratively towards a common goal. So top two is PLCs and student success criteria, and students being able to know what they're learning and how they are doing with it. Types of interventions that we might have. We have some academic interventions right here. Again, just some examples. These are not, certainly not an exhaustive list. But we thought it would be helpful to put it in here. Your tier 1 supports anything that you're doing in tier 1 can also be done in tier 2 and in tier 3. And then anything in tier 2 is also can be done in tier 3. So it's kind of like the list grows as we go from tier to tier to tier. So these are just some examples of things that you might be able to do to help intervene and to help students ensure that they are feeling successful. Anytime we're talking about interventions, we're talking about our standards. For reading, these are the reading anchor standards. This is for every single grade level. You work with key ideas and details, craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas, and the range of reading and text complexity. So everything that you're doing revolves around this. I wouldn't say that reading is an easier thing to intervene on, but it's helpful because you have that same sort of framework throughout every grade level. Here are some of the areas where you might have on the left-hand side, we have the area of concern, and then some of those supports that you might be able to use to be able to help with that area of concern. So we've got comprehension here, and these are all the things that you might be able to do for supports. Same thing for vocabulary, and so on and so forth. So these are just some general things that you might be able to use in your interventions, and how you might be able to map out your interventions and figure out what those students need. Same thing for writing. You've got some focus areas here, and then some of the supports that you might be able to use for your writing interventions. And then again, we're looking at our standards, the key concepts for math at each grade level. We're looking at, it's a little different for math. Our standards change from grade to grade. And so a lot of those prerequisite skills, we can't just take necessarily a concept and say, let's just simplify the numbers. Sometimes you can, but other times you need to go back and figure out what those prerequisite skills are that students need. So we want to always be looking at our standards. And then here are some of the areas of concern that you might have, and some supports for your math intervention. One of the things that I'm just going to get up on my soapbox for 2 minutes about sort of the fact fluency. And I know in the earlier grades, a lot of intervention around math has to do with students knowing their facts. I just want to make it really clear that a lot of these supports on the right-hand side here are the ways in which you're going to have students be able to understand their facts and not have it be a skill and drill, to have them build numbers. Facts to 10 aren't just 5 and 5, 7 and 3, 8 and 2, 6 and 4. They are what numbers make 6, what numbers make 7. And we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to have students understand things conceptually. Here's some other things when it comes to SEL and behavior interventions. So you have your areas of concern on the left, and then supports that you might be able to do for SEL and behavior interventions as well. I'm gonna leave it there and move on to Marissa.
Okay. Lastly, we're just going to talk about some progress monitoring methods that you can use. So, and there, I do see a question, so we can address that in just a minute. So what is progress monitoring? What are we talking about? Like when we had those sheets, are those instructional cycle planning, and we talked about progress monitoring. It's really just a way in which we evaluate, how students are doing, as well as our effectiveness of our instruction and our intervention strategies that we are choosing for students. So it's systematic, and it is a form of assessment. So we just want to make sure that we are frequently evaluating student progress, so that way we can make changes in order to adapt to how they're doing. So this progress monitoring is done throughout this PLC cycle, which is roughly 6 to 8 weeks, depending. If you're in a high school, it might look a little different if you're on semesters or trimesters. But a 6 to 8 week PLC cycle is typically when that progress monitoring is done.
And then just to talk really quickly about the question that we had, is one of the questions was, how often do PLCs meet? It used to be that PLCs were on like a 6 to 8 week cycle, and we just talked about interventions. Maybe they met in between. Now we really think about when we're looking at PLCs, maybe the data dive is done every 6 to 8 weeks, but we meet in our teams, our sort of PLC teams as often as we can because we're talking about that peer collaboration. We're talking about how students are doing, and we're doing that far more frequently than just when we're doing our data dives.
So we want to make sure that when we are doing this progress monitoring, that it should be at regular intervals. So we want to make sure that we are doing this frequently. We want to make sure that it's non-invasive. We want to keep it short for students and for ourselves. We want to make sure that we are recording and charting how students are doing. So we want to make sure we're collecting this data so we can really determine how students are doing with the interventions and our teaching and where we can go from there. We want to make sure that this progress monitoring is, strictly targeted to those skills that are being retaught. So when we do this, like keeping it short, non-invasive, we want to make it specifically targeted to those skills. We want to make sure that it is easy to implement for, like we said, both students and ourselves. And we want to make sure that, it's changeable depending on student performance. So not only are we monitoring how students are doing, but we are analyzing that, whether we're recording it or charting it, we're analyzing it and knowing that it is flexible and fluid and that it is changeable based on that information that we are getting. So what this might look like. So these could be 1 minute running records. If you have those already for students, if you don't, there's a ton of resources online that you can get some, or some fluency checks for math or reading. And that's not that fluency, those time tests. That's, how students are doing with their reading or their math. Are they understanding it in an efficient way? Meaning when you do those short timed progress monitoring checks, is it happening in that time? It might look like a few targeted problems based on those specific skills. So you could choose a few problems to give to students, kind of like a formative or an exit ticket. If we're looking at writing, we could do a work sample. So you could have a writing prompt for students, see how they do with that. It could be small group work, and you're collecting data while they're working. So it could be, their classwork data, the discussions that they're having if you're looking for understanding for students. It could be conferencing with a student one-on-one, and you're taking, observational notes based on maybe that conversation that you're having and what they're doing. So where we can find tools and information, we have some links here for you. So EasyCBM, the RTI Action Network, and the Institute of Educational Sciences. So these are some links for you. They have some resources, they have research. So these are, again, there for you that you can take a look at and have these tools for you to use in your classrooms. We've also listed IXL. Yes, you need a subscription, but you do have access to a few, I know, like a small amount of questions if you don't. Edmentum is all subjects, a great progress monitoring tool. Yes, you have to purchase, but there's also Alex, that's strictly for math. And then EdSurge is math and reading, accelerated math and reading. So these are just some examples of how we can record and chart progress monitoring in our classroom. So this is just an example for fourth grade, a chart that we can do where we're dating how this specific student is doing. And we're really just charting. We're working on our multiplication facts and our mind might go to timing. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about different methods for multiplication and learning their multiplication, different strategies that they're using. Are they able to show it in different ways? So charting just those ways and how, if they're getting those facts correct based on those methods and when. We also have this graph that can just show you, we have how many weeks of instruction, right? If we've instructed for 3 weeks and we are not improving, we know that something's not working. We need to change it up. So just showing that we have student performance, we have our weeks of instruction, hopefully we see growth in our graph. Also that conferencing with students. So this is great. This is quick. It's that checklist. We have our focus areas. We can check off how that student did in that conference. Looking for if they're asking questions to generate discussions. So a quick little check, maybe some notes that you want to take, and maybe a focus for the future if they didn't get specific check marks in certain areas. We also have this charting example. This could be for both students or yourself. So if you want students to track their own progress, this is something they could do. This is a reading progress monitoring tool for them to either chart themselves or you could chart for them. Again, it's important to share with students where they're at. So having them, do it as well would be very beneficial. And again, we just wanted to keep this instructional cycle in there one last time, because this is really what we're talking about here. This is kind of summarizing what we did today. We needed to, figure out what our learning objectives were. That was the standard in which we wanted to focus on for this cycle goal. A little more to it, you can unpack standards, really identify what are those big ideas and questions students need to know and learn. We need to determine assessments, determine what those common formative assessments are, maybe what an end of unit assessment is, rubrics, also the progress monitoring tools that we want to use that can help. We want to make sure we're instructing and assessing our students. But then came these 2 questions of what are we going to do if they haven't learned it and what will we do if they have? And that really was today focusing on what interventions and supports can we put in place in our tier 1 instruction, also tier 2 and tier 3, but for all of our students. So we're adjusting our lessons and instruction. We are assessing students. We are analyzing that data. We are changing up our instruction, and we're doing this together with our peers. We're working as a PLC. We're figuring out what's working for our kids. We're figuring out what's not working for our kids, our students, and we're doing everything that we can for them to make growth. If you have any more questions, I know we wrapped up quickly at the end there for timing, please definitely ask them in the Q&A. We're just gonna go through our wrap up, but we're still open for questions. So just a reminder, this is our PLC binder. It is linked. It has every document from all 4 PLC series here, also in an order that makes sense for how the kind of year goes in a PLC model. So this is our contact information. Reach out to Heather or myself if you have any other questions. Kristen Crawford's also listed here from the New Hampshire Department of Education if you have any other further questions for her. We thank you so much for being a part of this series, or if you've made it to all 4 of the PLC series altogether. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your week and be safe in the snow. Bye, everyone.